Hello everyone, welcome back to the Red Team training series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to gain initial access to a Linux target. Now, we've already explored the process of gaining access to a Windows target, and now that we have that out of the way, let's take a look at essentially how to exploit and gain access to a Linux target that has been set up by our target company and essentially hosts a web server or a website. In regards to what we will be covering in this video, we'll get started by taking a look at how to exploit the public-facing web application that's being hosted on this Linux server. And then secondly, we'll take a look at how to gain access to the MySQL database server that's running on the target server, right? So our job here is to firstly obtain initial access, and then secondly, take over some of the services that are running on the target system. So again, when it comes down to the Mitre attack framework initial access techniques, the one we're focusing on now is going to be the process of exploiting public-facing applications. So in the Windows video, we explored the process of essentially performing, exploiting remote services, phishing, etc., etc. So we're going to be taking a look at how to exploit a public-facing application now. So in this particular scenario, we're going to be using a target virtual machine as our target server, and you can download this virtual machine from VulnHub, and the name of this virtual machine is Raven1. So again, you can go ahead and download the OVA file and import it into VirtualBox or into VMware if you want to follow along with the techniques highlighted in this video. The objective of this video is to take you through the methodological process, from performing an nmap scan on the target, identifying the services running, exploiting the web application, gaining initial access, and then gaining access to the MySQL database server. So again, these procedures can be replicable, but in this case, we're going to be using this as our target, just so that I can explain a few things as we move along. As you can see, this is our infrastructure. It's fairly simple. The scenario is that we have identified the website or the web server that hosts the website for our target company. The target server is hosting a WordPress site. It's utilizing MySQL because WordPress is a content management system that requires a database. And in this case, the database of choice is MySQL. And it's also running OpenSSH and has the SSH port open to allow for authentication to the Linux server. That being said, that's pretty much all that we need to get out of the way in regards to the to the theoretical section of this video. Let's move on to my Kali VM so that we can get started with the practical section of this video. All right, so I'm on my Kali virtual machine, and I have already identified the IP address of the target server. You should have been able to do this during the reconnaissance video, where we highlighted all of the techniques that you can utilize to find out the IP address of a server or that again hosts either a web application or any other application that is being utilized by the company. The first thing we're going to need to do is perform an nmap scan on the target. So the nmap scan we're going to be performing in this particular case is a fairly simple one, and I'll explain what's going on. But before we do that, my current working directory is on my desktop under the Red Team folder and under Linux. So I just want to make that clear before we get started, because we'll be referencing files within this directory. You can create your own directory that you want to work in. So I'll say sudo nmap, and I'll perform a SYN scan or a stealth scan. And then I'll also perform an aggressive scan, which is a combination of service version detection, operating system detection, and you also have the ability, or this particular scan flag allows you to perform or run all nmap scripts against all the ports that are currently open on the target. We will scan all ports, all TCP ports on the target, so that when we say -p-, that refers to the entire TCP port range, which is about 65,535 ports. To speed up the scan, we'll use the timing template T4, and then I'm going to paste in the IP address of the target, which in this case I've just done, and we're going to output the results into a normal readable format. So we'll use the ON option there, and we'll I'll simply call the file nmap all.txt, right? And I'll hit enter. Now this scan is going to take a few seconds to a few minutes based on your target. In my case, the target server is running on my local network, so it shouldn't take too much time at all. I'm going to let this scan complete and then we can move on to the next step. All right, so the nmap scan is completed. And you can see that we have 2 ports, or rather 3 ports that are currently open. One of them is running SSH on the default SSH port, which is 22. The service version is OpenSSH 6.7p1. The web server, which is running on port 80, is running Apache HTTPD, and we can get the operating system banner, which gives us an idea of what operating system the target is running. In this case, we can see that the server is most likely running Debian, right? So we pretty much have that. We were able to identify that. We also have an RPC port here, which is on the default port number, as well as another RPC port that's running on port 55995. So this is one of the reasons why you should perform a comprehensive scan on all TCP ports, because some ports may be configured, or some services may be configured on ports that are out of the typical range associated with standard services. So that's a tactic or a strategy that is typically employed by administrators or security analysts in order to avoid first of all detection by individuals without much experience in regards to scanning for services. So if they run a service like the web server on a port that is not standard, like 55995, it'll be quite difficult to detect it unless you scan all TCP ports. That being said, we can try and access the web server here. So I'm just going to copy the IP and we can access the web server. So I'm just going to paste it in my browser. And you can see that this is their website here. This is the target website. And it simply looks like a security website here where they outline some of their services that they provide. And yeah, so now that we have that opened up, we can now try and perform some analysis on the web application. Initially, from my first look at this, it appears that this particular site, as you can see, if I click on a interactive button here, you can see that it essentially does not redirect to that particular web page, which gives me an idea of what might be running here. And taking a look at the source, it's clear that this particular website is a landing page template that really doesn't have any content management functionality here, in that everything is programmed statically via HTML and CSS, and there's very little JavaScript. So the first thing we want to do is just copy the IP address here, and we are going to run a directory brute force with GoBuster. You might remember that I mentioned this during the reconnaissance video, but I'll be taking you through it practically now. So GoBuster, again, can be installed on Kali Linux by typing in sudo apt-get install GoBuster. I already have it installed, so we can actually move on to the next step. So again, directory brute forcing is the process of identifying hidden files and directories that are currently on a web server, right? So we're going to try and do that. So for example, if I try and access the robots.txt page, you can see that it tells me that that's not found. So again, if we go through this process manually of trying to identify files, it's going to take a while. Instead, we can use a tool like GoBuster to perform a directory brute force. So I'll provide the command dir or directory to essentially specify that this is a directory brute force, and then I specify the URL of the target, and then I can specify the word list that I want to use. In this case, I will use the word list under user share seclists. Seclist is a very useful word list collection for penetration testers and red team specialists. So for example, if I just search for it here on Google, it should come up. It's a open source GitHub repository that contains a series of extremely useful word lists that can be used for directory brute forcing, fuzzing, pattern matching, etc., etc. So you can clone it into your user share directory or any directory that you're comfortable with, and you can use it that way. So in order to invoke a particular word list, I'm going to say we're performing web content, we're performing a discovery. We're performing discovery by directory brute forcing, and then we'll say web content, and then I'm going to use the big word list, which is a very comprehensive word list that contains a list of commonly used directories and file names that that are actually used by websites, content management systems, by Apache, Nginx, etc. And then I'm going to specify the threads, so I can increase my brute force rate by typing in threads and specify maybe 20 threads. The default thread rate is 10, but you can speed it up or reduce it based on whether or not your target has a rate limiting set up, right? So I'll just hit enter. It's going to begin the directory brute force. As you can see, it's going to give you a list of results that it was able to identify with their status codes. Now these are HTTP status codes. In this case, you can see that for the ones from CSS all the way to WordPress, these are all redirects, right? Which means we need to test them manually. So it was able to detect CSS, fonts, IMG, JS, and these look like directories that belong to the standard landing page template here. And again, I'm guessing that this is just set up for the public to actually get information about a company. However, we also detect that we have a WordPress directory, which is where I'm guessing they have their WordPress installation or the WordPress site that they're currently working on. And we can access it again by typing in WordPress. We hit enter. Give that a few seconds, and it looks like this is their WordPress site. It looks like, again, they're still working on it because there isn't any theme that's set up. We only have the content here, and it looks like we have a few posts. So if I click on the Hello World post, it's going to tell me that we're having trouble finding that site. And this is primarily because this virtual machine essentially has a domain name that we need to add to our hosts file in order to access. Now, typically this will not be the case, but again, when working with a website, you want to be accessing it from the domain name as opposed to the server IP, right? Unless you're interacting with the server directly, either through SSH or MySQL, etc. So I'm just going to add this this domain name to my hosts file, right? So I'm going to say etc hosts, and I'll just insert. I'll paste in the name of the domain there. So I'll get rid of the HTTP option here, and then I'll just get the IP address, which is, again, if I can identify it here, let me just take a step back. The IP address here. So that's 192.168.2.157. So I'll say 192.168.2.157. And what we're essentially doing here is we are saying that whenever we look up the following IP, it should redirect to raven.local, which is the domain name, right? And it works vice versa. So when I type in raven.local, it'll access this IP address. So it works very similar to if you're working with a website, a target website with the domain name. So with that done, I can now click on the Hello World post, and you can see that loads up correctly, and it looks like their posts page is working just fine. Now, when it comes down to WordPress and performing enumeration on a WordPress site, there are multiple tools that we can use, but manual checks also reveal quite a bit. Number one, the reason why I clicked on the posts page is because the posts page will typically reveal an author that actually wrote and posted that particular blog post. And in this case, we can see that we have the user Michael here. So we've been able to identify that there is a user called Michael. And again, that gives us an idea of, again, what direction we should take. So we can either, try and brute force the WordPress login page. Alternatively, we could also try and brute force the SSH service with the user that we've just identified, in the hopes that we'll be able to identify this user's password. So it's entirely up to you. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to perform a WordPress scan using the WordPress scan utility on this particular website, on the WordPress website, not the default Apache or the default landing page, the HTML landing page. In order to do this, I'm just going to type in WordPress scan, and WordPress scan comes pre-packaged with Kali Linux, so you don't have to install it. I'm going to say URL, and the URL is HTTP 192.168.2.157, and then I'm going to say WordPress because that's where WordPress has been installed. And then I'm going to say under the WordPress content directory, I want to enumerate all users and all plugins. So I'll say AT and EU. So that's going to enumerate all users on this particular WordPress installation based on mostly passive techniques, although you can actually brute force. You can actually brute force with WordPress scan in order to identify users. In this case, I'm just going to hit enter. We're going to give that a few seconds. It's going to say, would I like to update my WordPress scan database? I'm going to hit no, because I don't need to do that right now. So it's going to perform a scan and it's done. And I'll just go through the results with you and explain what's happened here. So it'll go through and display the headers for the website. It's also going to tell you whether XML RPC is enabled or disabled. XML RPC, again, is a great vector for performing brute force attacks on a WordPress website. And we also have, as you can see, the WordPress version. And then it enumerates users via passive and aggressive methods. In this case, it brute forced the author IDs. And it actually tells us that we have two users. We have Stephen and Michael. Right now, based on what we were able to identify on the target website, on the WordPress website within their blog posts, we can see that a post has been made by Michael. So we can again deduce or make deductions as to what roles or permissions the user Michael has. In this case, it looks like the user Michael is the administrator, the WordPress administrator. The reason I'm saying that is because whenever you install a new WordPress site, the Hello World post is automatically added by WordPress, and it's added as the administrator user. Remember, because this is the first blog post that again is added automatically without being added by any other user, and it's typically added by the administrator of the WordPress site. So from this, we can pretty much tell that Michael is the administrator, right? And that's very, very important here. So now that we've identified two users, we can actually work with the user Michael here. And as I said, there are two ways we can go about doing this. The first way we can actually seek to obtain initial access is to perform some brute force attacks on the SSH port in order to try and identify the password for either one of these users. Now remember, we don't know for certain that these users are actually user accounts on the system. We're simply making an assumption based on the fact that again we were able to identify them. And again, the second assumption is that the user Michael is an administrator. So we'll use the user Michael for our test here. So in order to perform a SSH brute force, we will be using the Hydra utility. All right, so if I type in what is Hydra, you can see that Hydra is a very fast network logon cracker, which supports many different services. So we are going to use it to perform a brute force. So I'm going to say Hydra. I specify the username that we want to perform the brute force, the password brute force for. In this case, the user is Michael. I then need to provide the password list, or the list that contains a series of passwords that you want to perform a word list brute force with. So again, in this case, you can create your own word list based on what you think the user's password may be. Alternatively, you could use the RockU word list that comes prepackaged with Kali Linux, and it has a good amount of commonly used passwords that again will give you the highest chance of success, although performing brute forcing or brute force attacks does not guarantee any success at all. However, in this case, we'll say the directory of the password list is under user share word lists, and the name is rocku.txt. All right, and then what I need to provide is the protocol we're brute forcing, and that is SSH, and then I specify the target IP, which in this case is 192.168.2.157, and I hit enter. It's going to begin the brute force. So I'm going to give that a few seconds. All right, so the brute force is complete, and it took a few seconds. As you can see, it was able to identify that the user Michael has a password of Michael, which is not good security practice by the user Michael. But again, this virtual machine was set up to teach you these techniques and show you that indeed you can identify legitimate SSH credentials by performing a brute force attack. Now, one way to counter this, and this is on the blue team side of things, is to actually disable password-based authentication for SSH and utilize key-based authentication, right? In this case, however, the user Michael has simply set his own username as the password. So we can now try and log in to the SSH port, or we can try and log into the server via SSH. This can be done by typing in SSH Michael as the user and typing in the IP address here of the target server. And I'm just going to hit enter. It's going to ask me for the password for the user Michael. In this case, the password is just Michael, and we have obtained initial access to the target system via SSH. All right, so we're currently the user Michael on the system. The first thing we want to do is enumerate the distribution and kernel version. So again, we'll say cat etc release. We can see the target is running Debian 8. If we want to enumerate the kernel version, we'll say uname A, and that tells you that it's running kernel version 3.16.06, which again appears to be outdated because it was it's released in 2018. So we may have some, we actually may target the kernel during the privilege escalation video, but we'll get to that when we actually reach there. So again, to enumerate the users on the target system, we're going to say cat etc password. And we can see we have the user Steven here, which again we can log into, but we don't have his credentials. We have the user Michael. We have the other service accounts here, like MySQL. We also have the www data service account, as well as the root account here, which is where we want to get to eventually. However, as you probably can tell, we have obtained initial access. However, we need to take a look at some of the services that are running on the target system. So I'll just take a look at, I'll just type in the netstat command and see what ports are currently running, or what ports are currently open, or what services are currently listening on the target. As you can see from the nmap scan, we weren't able to identify the MySQL server as open. And that is because it has been configured to run locally and is not exposed on the internet, which is a good security practice that you should be doing. So you never want to enable remote authentication to MySQL. And one way of doing that, as I've already highlighted in my previous series, is to disable to actually disable remote authentication. Now we can see that it's running on port 3306. So how do we get access to the MySQL database? Well, if you realized, or you noted earlier on, the web server is running WordPress, right? Now, WordPress by default will require the MySQL credentials, or will require MySQL credentials to create the WordPress database, the tables, and add data, etc., etc. And secondly, it will require the MySQL credentials to interact with the database, so to add new users, to add new data, so on and so forth. Now, if we navigate to the var www.html directory, this is where the front end, or the landing page, was actually stored. You can see that it looks like we also have the zip file that was which I believe is actually being utilized or was used to set up the landing page. You also have a few other directories here, but as you can see here, we have a WordPress directory, right? So let's navigate to the WordPress directory where the WordPress installation is stored. If we list out the contents here, you can see that we have the WordPress config.php file. Now, the WordPress config.php file is where the MySQL database credentials are typically stored. And this file is typically kept secure as possible, in that you cannot access this via the web browser, which again prevents anyone from reading it. So now that we have access, we can actually open it up with Vim. But do we have Vim installed on the target? No, we don't. So we'll use nano, and we'll say WordPress config.php. Sorry, I did not type in the PHP there. I'll hit enter, and you can see this is the base configuration for WordPress. This file contains the following configurations: MySQL settings, secret keys, database table prefix, and the absolute path. As you can see here, we have the database name, which is WordPress. That's standard. The database user is root. and the database password is Raven Security. All right, so again, in this particular case, the administrator was again not really helping himself here, because instead of creating an unprivileged database user, they have essentially utilized the MySQL root credentials, which means we can now log into the MySQL database server and make changes to the WordPress installation. For example, we can change the password of the user and much more. So we can actually just copy the password here, and I'll exit out of Nano, and we can log into the MySQL database server, because again, we're authenticated and it's running locally, so we can actually authenticate to it. So to do this, we will say MySQL, and then we specify the user we want to log in as. In this case, it's the root user, and then we specify the password. So we'll paste in the password there, hit enter, and voila, we are logged into the MySQL database server. So the first thing I want to do is, again, I can say show databases. We can see that we have the default databases related to MySQL, and then we have the WordPress database. So we will use the WordPress database, and then we can say show tables. And you can see within the WordPress database, these are the tables available. The WordPress users table is where user credentials are stored. Now, in most cases, or rather in all cases now, WordPress will encrypt the passwords using an algorithm like MD5, right? So for example, if I say select from WordPress users, which will display the all the data within the WordPress users table, you can see that it will display the two users that again, it will display the two users on the WordPress site that have access to the WordPress site. Another key thing to note, as I said, and it's actually been confirmed here, is the user ID. Now, by default, the WordPress user ID 1 is allotted to the administrator, because the administrator user is the user that's added first to the WordPress installation as opposed to second or third. So we can tell that Michael is the WordPress administrator, and again, we were able to deduce that earlier. We also get his email, when the user was registered, and the password hash. In this case, the password has been encrypted in MD5. However, again, we don't need to crack it in order to identify that password and log into WordPress. We can instead change Michael's password because we have access to the MySQL database. This can be done by saying update WordPress users. And we want to set the user pass option, which again we're getting from here. So the user pass option, again, it looks because I've zoomed into my terminal here or increased the font size, the ASCII output here is not being displayed correctly, and the columns are slightly mixed up, but it'll still work just as fine here. But so we'll say set the user password to. We then want to encrypt it with MD5. And then we are going to specify within the brackets our new password. So we can change it to something like password 123. Of course, I don't recommend doing this during a red team engagement, primarily because you want to ensure that your presence is not detected, and you again want to avoid any detection. And detection could come in the form of the administrator or the user Michael realizing that his password has been changed. So again, that's not a good thing, but in this case, we're just taking a look at an example. Alternatively, I would recommend creating another user, but in this case, we want administrator access. So I'm going to say password 123, and we will then say where the user ID is 1. So we're changing the password of the user with the user ID of 1, which in this case is Michael. I'm going to hit enter. It's going to say query OK, one row affected, so on and so forth, right? So now that that is done, we can try and log into the WordPress site. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm just going to go to the WordPress login.php page. This is how you log into WordPress. As you can see, it works out fine just there. The username is Michael. We can also log in using their email. We can actually try that. So can we? Yeah, we can actually use the username or the email, and the password is password 123. We hit login, and voila, we have logged into the WordPress administrator, user, and you can see that we are on the dashboard and we can pretty much do anything we want to the site. We can update it, we can check out the media, check out other users, or start taking a look at user data, so on and so forth. And yeah, we pretty much have owned or taken ownership of the MySQL database and consequently the WordPress installation. We've also been able to gain access to the target system via SSH by performing a brute force attack. And now the next step, of course, is to establish a form of persistence. And then we'll be taking a look at how to elevate our privileges to the root user, or again, to the user with root privileges. In this case, we know that the user root is pretty much the only user with root privileges. So that is going to be it for this video. As I said, you can follow along with the techniques and the examples demonstrated in this video by downloading the target VM provided in the documentation and the slides of this video. And you can again follow along. And yeah, that's going to be it for this video, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.